Thank you so much, and I'm also a Webshop participant from 2002, I think. So thank you so much for having me back.
Ruined your career coming.
And I'm coming to this topic from a very different angle. And 10 years ago, when I was here, I actually felt completely out of place because I didn't have the quantitative skills to do these big data analysis that everyone was talking about. Although I was really interested in how organizations are picking up internet innovations. And so I tried to find my own way in studying these kinds of topics. And so what I did was when I started to teach at the Maxwell School in 2008, I had designed this just regular e-government class telling my students how, the IRS lets you upload your tax returns. So those were great innovations at the time. And then the Obama campaign happened throughout the semester. And so basically I switched my whole syllabus up and said we're only focusing on social media from now on. And the other thing that's really particular, I think, about my case is that I had this really diverse background, and then I came to a school where there's a very deep disciplinary focus for junior faculty. So they want us to publish in public administration journals only, to have a very specific audience. So going outside of the 5 journals that we know is basically not allowed for the first 5 years. So I decided to look at how the lessons learned during the Obama campaign were then institutionalized in government. And the way that emerged was that we saw so many social media innovations popping up in all kinds of different departments. So DHS is using it for emergency management to reach out to audiences that they usually don't reach. Obviously, Obama is doing these huge collaborations with Twitter and Facebook, and the White House is really at the forefront of innovating with social media. Interesting enough, organizations like the FBI have recently started Facebook pages to crowdsource evidence, basically, and try to find murderers or people, and try to find crowdsource basically information from the public. They're very bad in organizing and keeping track of the comments that are made, because it's citizens are only bashing government in those comments, so they're not really helping out there. Then the revolutions are obviously happening around the world, everything kind of mitigated by Twitter. And at the same time, government understands that so many people are on social networking sites. So that kind of all drove me to try to understand how people in government perceive these technologies and what kind of decisions are they making to then actually adopt social media in an environment that is very much not driven by social interactions. It's a very formal press release kind of communication style. And so what happened in parallel to people experimenting with social media was that one day after the inauguration in 2009, President Obama then sent out this memo and said, my government is driven by the Transparency and Open Government Initiative, and I want all the executive departments and agencies to harness new technologies. And he followed that up by a lot of different speeches saying that, we need someone like Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook to be someone in government who is as entrepreneurial. So we need to empower government employees to be the next Mark Zuckerberg, but in a government agency. So this, you can define that as a mandate for the executive departments if you want. They were actually very slow in reacting to this. So a year later, there was a deadline set for all of them that they actually have to come up with a plan within the next 60 days and how they would accomplish this, because there was, government agencies usually react slower than other types of organizations. So for some of them it was a mandate, for others it was, yes, let's do this. Finally we are allowed to do innovative things, but no one really knew how to do it. And so that's kind of the context in which I'm operating, and I decided to go out and see what do we know about ICT adoption in government. everyone always says there's like this 10-year time lag between what happens in the corporate sector and all kinds of other organizations to what then happens in government. And we know from the literature that innovative technology use is mitigated by all the rules that are already in place. So my understanding was therefore that, okay, if there are so many rules that really are not tailored towards social media, then probably government agencies are not adopting them. On the other hand, we saw all these great examples popping up, so it's a real paradox why they would be adopting social media. There are all kinds of theories out there on how innovations are diffusing. So most of them are that over time more and more people jump on the bandwagon and then they're adopting. Others look at the location where the innovation is coming from. And then obviously a lot of them are looking at stages, going from early adopters or innovators to the laggards that you will never get on board, because then there's already the next wave of innovation coming in. Or that we are moving from the simple users of technology to more complex kinds of technologies. And what my colleague Stu Brettschneider and I have recently done is to look at what types of technological innovations there were in government. And we kind of defined social media as kind of the fifth wave of e-government. So following the internet and email, that was about 10 years ago when government started to use more interactive types of technologies. Nevertheless, the way I look at it and what I also find in my research is that social media still stays a huge paradox for government. They have these really strict rules and these information vetting processes internally on what kind of information goes out. The press release rule is there are so many steps involved and so many feedback loops and so many people involved and managers who have to sign off and counselors and lawyers and so on until you actually get the final product up on your website. It takes weeks sometimes. So it's a real conundrum or a paradox to the way that the fast and furious exchanges you see on Twitter and Facebook and on blogs where people are commenting and then they're expecting obviously that government comments back and responds to their comments. So I always like to use this picture of the six blind men touching an elephant, and everyone would describe the technology or their use of it or what they understand the tools can do for them as an agency in very different words, right? And I mean that also fits in with how Twitter describes how you can use that technology. It's what you make it, right? All of you are now experiencing the back channel note-taking kind of things that are going on, maybe even for the first time. Others might not be tweeting at all. And for others, this is just you're reading through it and it's nice to have. So for everyone, it's kind of a different animal that you are describing there. So for me, going into this research, I tried to understand how are those managers, those public managers, are then making the decision and why are they using social media? And when they made the decision, so opening up this black box of the decision-making process that then leads to the publicly observable behavior that most of you are studying by just looking at Twitter feeds. So that's usually a really black box. What's the decision-making process that leads up to the decision? Yes, it's okay to set up a Twitter account, or yes, we want to engage on Facebook. And after that decision is made, what are the tactics that they are using? And so I went in with those really global questions, and my case, as I mentioned before, were all those agencies who received the official mandate. So it's a very small sample, but I'm a qualitative researcher, so I decided to go for the full census, basically saying all the executive departments in the executive branch of the US federal government. About 10% of those people who are responsible for social media are located in the IT departments, and most of them are actually in the public affairs offices. So it's already, if I should put a label on this, they are in the right position to actually do the communication part and don't just see this as, we have to provide the technologies for others to use it. I got a pretty high response rate in terms of people that are willing to talk to me. And so I decided also to add highly interactive agencies that I thought they were really innovative in what they were doing. I was asked last night, how the hell did I get access to those people? And that's a very valid question, because those are elite agencies, right? They have this one person, who's usually a director of a department. They don't like to talk to the media, especially in situations like this, where here in the US, the General Services Administration is going through this huge organizational crisis. I don't know if you guys heard about this, but they spent money on a conference in Las Vegas where they had clowns dancing for them. They had these team exercises where they built really expensive bikes for themselves, and then they came up with dummy awards so that they were allowed to actually spend money on dinners because there was an award. So they stretched the rules, plus then they had this social media firestorm of GSA employees creating YouTube videos. So everyone is extremely guarded at the moment because they know they are spending lots of money on social media. It's obviously a public channel, right? And you don't want to compromise your position in times of budget crisis and organizational crisis. So what I did was, for a very long time, I just observed who in government is actually using Twitter. I've done other studies on Congress and nonprofits and corporate. But I followed the hashtag Gov20, which is who is interested in government, or it's recently also changing to social gov. That's a really interesting hashtag just to follow, to see what are the hot topics right now. What is government concerned about? What are their problems that they're facing? Who are they reaching out to? Who's responding to their questions? Because we really have those issue networks around specific problems and challenges, and people who want to help. And so some of them I contacted on Twitter, followed up with emails. They were all very generous. In 2010 and 11, when I did my first round of interviews. And then I also asked them, hey, I don't have a contact at CDC, who's that person? Because there's no public phone book in the sense where you can just say, okay, I just want to see all the social media directors, because this position doesn't exist officially when I started. Now we have govloop.com. They are trying to keep up with that and actually created that online phone book where some of those people are. So that was my approach, and I was relatively successful in getting lots of people. Okay, so in terms of the data collection, what I decided to do is that I'm doing elite interviews. Usually when you go out and you are collecting your data, you have, in the US here, you have to go through an internal review board process and an approval. Government employees are exempt from this approval, but you still have to submit your questions so that your institution knows what kind of research you do and that you're not harming your subjects. So I came up based on the literature and based on some of the assumptions and my observations and the website codings that I did with a highly structured interview guideline. So first of all, I tried to ask them questions about their own background, obviously. How did they come to being the person in charge of social media? Then try to trace back how did their organization make the decision. So how did you start to talk about social media? Where did that come from? Why do you think this is an appropriate tool? Then how does do they even have a strategy? Do they have policies in place? How does this policy then fit to the mission of their organization? Because every government agency has a very different mission, obviously. Then do they even have an idea of who their audience members are? Audiences are not necessarily only those people who you can count as your Twitter followers, right? And then in terms of the audience who is on Twitter, that might be a different audience that they actually want to reach. So many of those federal agencies in Washington have obviously all of the American people as their audience, but then some of them are highly specialized. So FCC, for example, might have more lawyers and more researchers and scientists that are interested, but not the person who really wants to be in touch with the mayor in their local towns, right? So it's a sometimes very specialized audience. And then I asked them about their daily practices based on what I had coded before on their websites to understand what their interactions are online, and where the innovations were coming from. So when they started to do new things, I asked them, so where did you see that? Why are you doing this? And then also my biggest question was usually kind of the downer at the end of the conversation is, so how do you know that you're effective with what you're doing? What do you define as your own success in doing all this? I added lots of coding of archival documents. Obviously, I had to go back and see in what kind of context they are doing all this, what are the laws and regulations that guide their behavior, then congressional reports from the General Accountability Office that gives reports to Congress and says, federal agencies should be doing more in protecting privacy when they're using social media. And then I also ask all of them to give me their social media handbooks, guides, strategies, however they call this. We have, I think, 10 different terms for that. And I did all these, what I would call participatory observations of the hashtags. I'm teaching at GSA's Digital Government University. So I try some of the things that I find in my research, I try them out with the audience, with my audience at that Digital Government University. And the last one was really eye-opening because we kind of developed my own plan of how a social media strategy should be implemented. I developed that a little further with the audience in the room, so that was kind of a cool interactive moment. And then I'm really involved with having online discussions, mostly on Twitter with all those people. As I said, I coded all the sites, all the official government websites, but most of them actually they were really hesitant at the beginning to even place the buttons to the social media accounts, so I had to search for them. There was this, and I will tell you more when I show you the model. So there was this hesitance of marketing social efforts. It's very interesting. And I followed Darrell West's idea of how e-government services were coded on websites. So to give you a little bit of an outlook, how I use the method. So this is the method. Process tracing comes from political science, and it really tries to open this black box on how we arrive at the final policy document that then is presented to the public. And that's, so if you look at the Open Government Initiative, there are 3 different directives, basically. Government has to be more transparent, more participatory, and more collaborative. So the transparency angle is kind of checked off because of data.gov. Lots of data sets are uploaded, and that's kind of the flagship initiative. Engagement and participation, so when we look at social media, lots of information is kind of pulled into government, but it's then unclear how citizen feedback is actually used to come up with new decisions, with better strategies, with the final policy document. So the whole collaborative angle, how we are working together to then finally come up with the new policy, is a black box. So my goal was to use this kind of method to basically use my interviews and all the different data points to trace back how these decisions were made. And some people would tell me, well, that was really before my time, but what I heard from other people was that they just started to experiment, or at some point a manager came in and said, let's do this. So I tried with the narrative, I tried to trace this back. And the goal is to really understand what the causal chain was, who was involved and what times, why were those decisions made, and what was the final outcome. And what we never see with the final policy document that's really polished and nice, and you can download it from the web, is what were those disagreements, right? What were those struggles that people had to reach their decisions? What were the constraints in those decision-making processes? Or what were the rules that they thought they cannot change, or the reasons and the perceptions that people have? So that's why I use interviews in my research. And so I recorded, with their permission, all the interviews. I have over 600 pages of transcribed interviews. I use the software that's called QSI in Vivo. Others might know Atlas TI. It's basically the same type of software. It's a big database where you upload your Word files with the transcripts. You can also add PDFs, pictures, videos, and then tag them basically with codes. And you get a really rich data set by adding, you see the coding stripes on the side. So you're kind of quantifying almost your qualitative data. So you're trying to find where patterns are in the way that people talk about their decision-making processes. And then I also asked them, I mentioned earlier the locus of innovation. So how did they hear about how you can productively use Facebook pages for your agency? So I wanted to trace the network behind this, the social awareness network. Where do they hear about innovations? And I use UCINet and Netro. It's a very simple way in which I use it. Obviously, people like Bernie and Mark are doing this on completely different levels, but I thought it would be nice to just visualize what the social awareness network is. So what are my findings? First of all, and this is not surprising at all, there was a complete lack of formal instruction. What really guides any kind of online interaction, even until today, is the 2002 e-Government Act. 2002. That was before Zuckerberg started in 2004, I believe, Facebook and Harvard College, right? That was before the times of Twitter. That was really to help agencies understand how they are allowed to use their websites, what interactive elements there are, and the most interaction there is maybe a contact form or an email address. But there's very little follow-up, so if you send in an email to an agency, if you're lucky, you get an automated response back, but there's a huge lag time in responsiveness. So all the existing rules and regulations and policies were focused on government-hosted internet platforms or websites, but they never included third-party platforms like Twitter, where the technological features are completely in the hands of that company. Government has very little say in when Facebook decided to kill the Facebook groups, that there was actually huge amounts of data that those people in government have created because of the conversations that they had on those private groups, right? So government has very little say in what happens with the technological features when a company decides to shut things off, right? So none of this is regulated. So what happens, people are creating those informal business cases, and note the language. So in my world, a business case does not exist in government, basically. But basically, they're trying to understand how they can use it. They're creating anecdotes to then say, okay, we have this one example and it really worked well, so let's do this. Instructions and rules then followed up, and this might be interesting to you to understand from an organizational perspective, because government kind of forced all the social media providers, and I think they have by now more than 30 of them listed on how2.gov, in case you're interested to look that up, to create new terms of service agreements. So those are the things that you just check off every time you're creating a new account, and you are not reading through the 20 pages of rules that Facebook comes up with, what happens with your data, right? So government is not, obviously cannot give away the rights to all the data and to all the pictures that are posted on their government pages. So they had to come up with new rules for that, or that there is context-relevant advertisement on the Facebook page and these kinds of things. So they pre-negotiated those terms. There are other things that they came up with, records management. Elizabeth, I know you're working on that. So the National Archives came up with kind of a memo that states this is what happens with social media records, because every time we are interacting with government or government publishes something, it has to be recorded and archived. So those were all huge things that left people in this vacuum of not wanting to adopt, because they didn't know what happened with all the stuff that they're putting out there on third-party platforms, right? And then they lifted the cookie policy. Twitter had promised to kind of download everything to the Library of Congress. I believe it hasn't happened yet. And then they also came up with the plain language guide that's not just important for websites, but also in the way that you're interacting on your social media platforms. So one of the other findings I had was, given the lack of top-down advice, is that I tried to understand from what direction, who are people looking for in terms of guidance on what's appropriate and how should we be interacting on social media. So as you can see, the biggest innovator there, where a lot of people said, I look what the White House is doing, and had this great transition team with Katie Stanton, who's now at Twitter. And so lots of innovations are coming out of the White House, and then other agencies think it's appropriate to pick that up. Obviously, that's all focused on one person, right? That's a very different type of focus than other agencies have, right? The EPA is not just one person, or CDC is not just the director of the CDC. So it's a very different locus. But you can see that for those of you who are in that area, that other agencies that we already know are very innovative, like the CDC with that zombie preparedness attack is one of the innovators. EPA, where Jeff Levy is, who was also the organizer of the Web Managers Council, was very influential and very much out there. So people, and the Department of State, obviously, with Hillary Clinton and her e-diplomacy team. So you see that those who you're observing and who are in the press and in the media oftentimes are also thought out to be, kind of those in their passive observation network, that what they do is, okay, so we're looking at them and then we are just emulating them. And that's what I also found, and when I asked them, how do you know if this is appropriate or not? And it's really copying and pasting a lot of times. That people say, I'm just borrowing ideas. In government, that's not a problem. You can just copy what other people are doing. There are no property right issues. It's not like in the corporate world that Pepsi came up with the cool campaign and then we are copying it. That wouldn't be cool. But they say in government, everything is fair game. And that they just do it. If I see something, I just emulate the practice. And that's where innovation is coming from. Sorry. So what that tells me is that really the traditional technology adoption paradigm that we know from the public sector does not really hold true for social media anymore. So traditionally in government, there's usually a top-down decision. There's an investment decision. People are testing different tools. Let's say a new email system is supposed to be implemented. They have to send out an RFP. Big vendors are responding to it, and then there's a selection process, and then there is a top-down investment decision with a little bit of testing and maybe within the IT department or a test department. Then all the other departments are instructed, Monday morning you have a new email system, here's how it's working, and then there's bottom-up implementation, basically, so bottom-up use. Now with social media and what my research showed, this is very different. Instead of having this official top-down decision, what happens is this emergent bottom-up experimentation. I have the lighthouses in there, so a lot of people pay attention to what a few people in this very dispersed system are doing. They're looking at kind of guidance of what works in some areas, and then they're adopting it. They are looking at what comes from outside of government. So how are citizens using these tools? We better respond to that. If we are mentioned so many times online, then something is going on, and we should be part of those issue networks. So tons of experimentation that started, and then there were retroactive decisions that were then made top-down, and where then top managers said, okay, it's probably okay given the changes of the rules that we can now use this. So based on those that's kind of the context, I came up with this three-staged adoption model, and that's really driven by my research. The first stage is that a lot of people told me, social media use in government is like the Wild West. There's tons of early, really informal experimentation going on. I call these people who are willing to take the risk to go out there and just set up an account and try to dabble around with that on their it's really their private time in addition to their official job. So no one tells them from now on your job description includes this. Instead, they had just started to do to be social, and so they're really mavericks in the way, not in Sarah Palin's way, but in the way that they are working really outside the given IT infrastructure, outside the rules that existed. And they're departing from that. It's a high-risk environment that they were doing this in. It's a lot of uncertainty, and what we saw in those times, it's mostly pushing out. So whatever goes on the website, okay, just try to also put that video up on YouTube and send out a link to this press release out to Facebook and Twitter. And the reasons behind those tactics were that people saw the market-driven innovations, so that citizens were there. So we probably have to be in those spaces. And we needed to get the message out to those people that might not usually be engaged with us, because they felt that there are different audiences on Twitter than you usually have in your email contacts, newsletters, and so on. The second stage is what I call coordinated chaos. And the way, all those social media business cases are then creating more awareness within the organization. Okay, something goes on there, probably should be paying attention. But also, people notice that in different agencies, initiatives, teams, and departments within the overall EPA, there were then several different Twitter accounts that popped up, posting to the same types of audiences, sometimes misleading messages, and it was never really clear what's now the official EPA account, or is that just for this type of audience? So you have a lot of overlapping practices, and so people notice that and find that probably we should be streamlining what we are doing here with social media. Nevertheless, there's a still relatively slow uptake because of the lack of guidance and external regulation. But in this stage, I noticed agencies who are in that stage, they said, yeah, we started to kind of informally type up our social media guidelines or policy or comment policies and so on. So they have an informal document that they're adding to and trying to understand what are the things that we should tell people. But to the extent, one of my interview partners actually said, I'm never putting that on slides, but basically he said, we're giving people a context in these documents, we just say don't be an idiot. Obviously you can't give that out as a policy, but the Anthony Weiner scandals and so on drive people to saying we probably have to regulate our social media use a little bit so that we're not too exposed to criticism. Oh, yeah, sorry. Okay. So the tactics are then also evolving. People have more experience with this. They are more. They're trying to also pull in information. Great examples when they have contests or when they ask citizens to send in their pictures. USGS is doing this great thing with where they're mapping Twitter messages where earthquakes are, and they're adding that to their traditional, to their official and formal scientific evidence and measurement techniques. Yeah, but they understand that just pushing out information is not the only tactic. So they're developing more and more interactive tactics. The last phase is where then it really gets to the institutionalization phase. So how 2.gov was, for example, developed with really clear guidance from GSA, from one central agency that said, okay, we need a few tools that help us understand how you can write up a social media strategy and so on. So this last stage is really about formalization, where the formal guidelines are established not just to guide how employees and official account holders are behaving on those social media accounts, but also what is appropriate for the citizens that are trying to interact with us. So people are posting their comment strategy or policies then on their Facebook pages, and they're at that stage also confident enough to actually take down comments of citizens and not say that we're censoring free speech or anything. These are comments that have foul language and they are not in line with our commenting policy. Very clear information vetting processes are set in place, similar actually, so we're now going back to the formal press release communication paradigm where rules are set in place, how a blog post has to be written, who has to confirm that this is actually legally safe to post this, and so on. And then there's also formal resource allocation and a budget, and people are set in positions and they have the title of being the social media director or the social innovation director, or however you call them. And more interactive strategies and tactics that they are trying to be part of the network and the issue networks where people are discussing stuff. They're pulling in internal knowledge experts to be part of the whole social strategy, and also responding to citizens' requests and so on. One great example of how this has evolved is how you can all download these. So in 2010, the Army came up with a very great social media handbook, just saying, we know social, we do all these things, this is what you can do. Next, they actually said, this is how you do Facebook, this is how you do Twitter, this is how you set up an account, and this is appropriate online. They also added the mobile strategy. And then this year they came out with saying, okay, our audience and our guidelines are not only important for all members of the Army, but also we are extending that to their family members. So they bring out guidelines, and that very much is in line with how the Army works anyway, right? Your Army family members live on a compound. They have to follow the rules. They're not telling anyone where their spouse is stationed right now. You don't post geographic locations of warships or where you are in Afghanistan right now. So that fits, again, nicely into the mission of all of these organizations. I have, how much longer? 5 minutes? Okay. Then let me switch real quick to some of the, I think, open questions maybe, because that might be interesting to you. So some of the open research questions that I see and that you might be interested in trying to answer are, we really need to measure impact. And I know that a lot of you are trying to analyze Twitter networks, and for me that's really very much on the citizen side. So how are citizens engaging on Twitter using these tools? But it doesn't tell us much about how they actually feel, how we are changing behavior of government, how we are changing perceptions of how citizens feel about government, right? And on the other hand, now that we have all that big data coming into government and they have means of analyzing it, right now one of my interview partners actually say, yeah, measuring, yeah, we know how many followers we have, but really what we measure is the return on ignorance. So they're not really measuring right now. So there's this initiative going on right now where people are trying to find the appropriate metrics. So we can help government understand what they should be measuring to be more effective, more efficient, be more participatory and transparent, and so on. So on the government side, that's really interesting. Help them analyze, understand the metrics, interpret them, and then change their behavior and their tactics based on that, right? And on the citizen side is what the whole big data discussion is about. How do people react to it? What kind of impact are we making when we are social? And are people changing their political attitudes and so on? The other question that I have, and that's more, I guess, an information management question, is so how can we really create those organizational capabilities and governance mechanisms that change government in the way that they're responding and transforming institutions that we are creating with social media. So now that we're allowing them this, what kind of collaborative capacities do they need? So how do they sift through all those comments? How do they extract knowledge from them? How do we then take that knowledge and plug it into new policies and make those policies better based on the feedback that we get? And then are there even new policies that can come out of that? So you can Google one thing that's called Hooray Bloggers. That was really cool from the TSA. They picked up comments from the blogosphere, how people were screened at airports, and then a lot of bloggers said, this is really discriminating, and so they changed the way that their employees are now screening. So we need more of those examples where we see that social media actually has an impact in the way that government works. And I think I will leave it at that and have you ask me a few questions.
Any questions?
A question about number one here, because I agree that's one of the biggest points that's lacking, is really closing that loop and measuring. Do you have any suggestions of things that they might do to measure the impact and the outcomes of their strategies?
So I did get back to my question. Yeah, so, well, what I've seen is that a lot of people have, so someone actually told me, well, I have this Excel spreadsheet that I open every morning, and then I compare myself. They pull in follower numbers, so they really focus on the quantitative part. And then they compare themselves to the CDC and EPA and say, oh, all our slopes are going up, so we're doing a great job. We are fine on social media. I do believe that the quantitative part is important to look at because it shows you interest in when you are online activities, but it's not all. So we really need to do more of the text analysis kind of things. And right now, people are really just using anecdotes, you know, to manually sift through all those comments and try to understand what people are passionate about or not. So we need more sophisticated methods to do that. And I know that Jana Diesner is, I think, coming in later this week, and we are collaborating on a project to understand, you know, what are members of Congress posting and so on. So you can do that manually, but I think the qualitative part is much more important.
I think what you're doing is wonderful, and I encourage people here to join this effort and work and help federal agencies because they really need the help. But I have some concern. The first part is there are 3 barriers that government faces that you haven't addressed, and then I just want to talk about what's actually happening. Bev Godwin in the transition team had this 10 barriers to why government can't use or has difficulty using social media. So the first was terms of service, which require, Twitter says you have resolution of disputes is by the terms of the state of California. U.S. government agencies can't do that. So they have they not negotiated those?
Yes. Those were the landmark agreements that I mentioned.
So, there is a top-down systematic approach to trying to overcome the legal barriers. Secondly, you didn't address the issue about accessibility and usability, handicapped access. If a service does not provide accessibility, then the U.S. government can't use that. So that's another impediment. Is that?
Yeah, so I only focused on the 3 stages and how it was adopted, and not so much on the challenges. I have another paper on that. But yes, I did ask them about that. I actually designed an experiment in my classes where I have the students wear sunglasses and they smear Vaseline on it, and then I asked them to to tell me what's on this Facebook page, how they can read Twitter messages. And then they say, oh, I can't read anything. Well, then I say, where's the button on Twitter or Facebook or on this government website that helps you then as a visually impaired person to actually get the information? So the responses to the 548 disability requirements are kind of checked off every time I talk to them because they say, yeah, we're making sure that everything we are complying. But what they do is basically trying to publish it in different media. So provide it as a text, provide the transcript of a YouTube video, and these kinds of things.
The third barrier is the financial. It takes people time to do it.
Yeah.
And in the current situation in Washington, it's just impossible to spend extra time. I think people need to appreciate, having worked with government agencies, once you open a public site, and Library of Congress does guarantee 24-hour response to email or other attack. You're putting a huge burden on staff that's not funded by Congress and not requested by the legislative budgeting. So there are real impediments that I think would help to understand some of these things.
And that was actually one of my guiding questions. So given all these other really important things that your agency is doing, why do you invest in social media? If you can't measure the impact, but they all have a social media director, so they haven't made that investment. For them, it's really more about mitigating the risk right now. So it's no longer the question, should we be doing this or not? It's, yes, we are doing this, we need to do this. And we are doing it. We're trying to throw resources at it.
Just my other point.
But I want to add, yes, tons of resources are needed. This is not a one-man job. If you see how Obama had this whole team, a whole room full of people during his Twitter town hall, this was not President Obama just tweeting by himself. It's not happening.
But and your characterization that there isn't a centralized or top-down approach goes against some of my experience. I mean, Peter Orzak's memo in 2010 about how do government agencies run challenges was directed at all agencies. It opened the door to doing that. It was very centralized. I'm looking at the howto.gov page. There's a whole set of the recommendations that come from the administration about how agencies should do it. And your characterization is a little different from what my experience is.
Well, this is not a snapshot of what happened yesterday, right? This is a snapshot over time. As I said, I started with the 2009 memo, tried to trace what agencies are actually doing, did my first interviews in 2010, and all these rules and regulations were then retroactively basically trying to steer behavior in the right direction. So all those rules came later than when I started my research.
So one more question before we break. I think I still... Okay.
What about size of agency? So for example, if you look at the social media patterns of NARA, so archives, you see that the archive-in-chief basically has his own social media account. And you see that NARA has its social media account, and you see that individual archivists, depending on their division, have their sort of, plus they have an ongoing regular tweet, things like that. That's something that's affordable to a large structure, a big agency that has multiple venues for creating that director. But if you look at a smaller agency, like some of the grant-giving agencies like NEH, NEA, IMLS, ones like that, you have a much smaller and organic structure. So how does your study take into consideration the size of the agency?
Well, we need to distinguish between agencies and departments, right? Departments, so HHS would be the department, and then NIH is an agency that is part of HHS. I looked at department level, and then I added in a few really highly, innovative initiatives and talked to CIA, for example, which is part of DoD, obviously. And yes, you are right. Size, what I observed is that the larger the organization was, the more accounts were created at the beginning. But then there was this consolidation effort that they said, we can't have just every team and every initiative within an agency and the larger department just pop up those Twitter accounts. And a similar effort that kind of parallel went to that was that there were thousands of websites because there was no real guidance on who was allowed to set up a website. So now we have this tendency to shrink websites, and I think they want to consolidate it down to 2,000 websites. I did work on howto.gov on the social media registry with my RA, and we coded all the, I think we have 4,000 Facebook pages in government, 7,000 Twitter accounts, and so on. So we coded all of that, and most of, I think 2/3 of all the accounts are actually in DoD. So completely hung on that one. And then every department has to decide to what extent do they want to make this an official account or not. And so it's similar to Twitter's blue check mark, howto.gov or GSA has just created the social media registry to help agencies understand what are official sanctioned accounts that you can also quote and retweet and so on. So I'm not a quantitative researcher in the sense that I'm trying to understand all of the variables. For me, in this study, it was important to trace how people were making decisions and how were these decisions then consolidated over time.
11,000 Twitter accounts?
7,000, I think. You can look up the. It's in one of my IBM reports.
That's all.
That's all.
Right, seriously, if you got as large as the government is, that's a minuscule number compared to what could have been.
Right.
Okay. It's a great discussion, but I think if you'd like to have your break, I think we need to stop now. So let's thank Ines Mergel.